right? Like 郑成功的郑, huh? From the Department of History at the University of Minnesota, who will present on the cooperative construction of an imagined community, the politics of historical memory in Taiwan in 1950s. This is a very promising topic indeed. I will sit in the front and keep track of time. You'll get a notice for 5 minutes, a notice for 1 minute, and a notice when some of you haven't stopped, in which case the Wang Ye comes up to the microphone. 完蛋了. Okay, you're on.
So thank you, Chairman, for your kind introduction. My name is Hao-Wen Chen, and now I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. This is the topic of my talk today. Before I delve deeper into the arguments of my paper, I would like to tell you a story first. It's a story about a specific person whose name is Chen Yonghua. He was shown in both of these pictures, and the guy on the top right was him video and filmed in late 1980s and broadcast in the documentary. You can see that he pulled up his shirt with anti-communist tattoos on his chest as a way to show his loyalty to the Chinese nationalist government. So who is Chen Yonghua? Chen Yonghua was actually born in the year 1923 in southern part of Taiwan, present-day Tainan. He was the youngest son among four. And when the Chinese nationalist government took control of Taiwan after the year of 1945, he voluntarily enlisted in the Chinese National Army since he believed that he could alleviate the financial burdens of his family, since he was promised with good pay and better job opportunity in the future. And what's more important is that he was also promised, like all the Chinese soldiers, that they will never be sent out to mainland to fight against the communists. But unfortunately for him and other Chinese soldiers, he was sent to China to fight against communists, and he was captured and conscripted as a member of the Liberation Army over there. And shortly after the war broke out in Korea, Chen Yonghua was sent to Peninsula to fight against the United Nations forces as a member of the so-called People's Volunteer Army, the PVA, again. But it was also there that Chen Yonghua found a chance to defect from the Chinese Communist side and surrender to the United Nations forces. And it was there in the president of camps, a president of war's camps, that he got a tattoo on his chest as a way to show his loyalty to the government so that he can be sent back to Taiwan. And as we can see the picture on the left-hand side, that was a picture taken when Chen Yonghua's mother paid him a visit in a camp in Linkou, Taoyuan today. And you can see that the title of this image is called "Don't Cry, My Child." Chen Yonghua knelt down and cried when seeing his mother. This picture was published on the newspaper called Central Daily News, that's 中央日报, which was a mouthpiece or propagandist newspaper controlled tightly by the Chinese nationalists at that time. And it was also this picture that actually made Chen Yonghua one of, or maybe the most famous anti-communist hero, 反共义士, during the 1950s. But what actually made Chen Yonghua's experience so interesting is not limited to himself, but also the experience of one of his elder brother, whose name is Chen Yanqing. Chen Yanqing was shown in the picture on the bottom right. The lady on the right-hand side was their mother, and the guy on the left-hand side is Chen Yanqing. So who is Chen Yanqing? Chen Yanqing, he was a former Taiwanese Imperial Japanese statesman, which means he used to fight for the Japanese during the Second World War. And unlike his younger brother, who became a celebrity during the 1950s, Chen Yanqing's experience will remain largely unknown until a news article published in the year of 2009. So the interesting question here is that, first of all, why Chen Yonghua's story was popular and chosen as the most famous anti-communist hero during the 1950s, whereas his brother's memory would become suppressed for another decades until the 2000s. To answer those questions, I used newspapers such as Central Daily News, which was published and controlled by the Chinese nationalists and the mainlanders, and the other newspaper published by the islanders as well. I also used the governmental archives and, of course, oral history and secondary scholarship. And before we delve into the main argument, there are some common understanding of the historical memories about World War II and the Korean War in the 1950s. First of all, usually scholars believe that the memories about World War II, I use the term World War II here instead of the 8-year War of Resistance, 八年抗战, or the 15 years war, the Pacific War, or the Great East Asia War, since it's more neutral and less nationalism centered. So first of all, the memories about Korean War and World War II, the scholar used to believe that they were actually two independent memory, which means they were like memorized separately. Second thing is that the scholars also believe that during the 1950s, actually until the late 1980s, the mainlanders' memories about war, which is the 8-year war of resistance, was dominating at that time. Whereas the islanders' memories about war, especially those people's, the Taiwanese Imperial Japanese settlements memories, was suppressed. So it seems that there's a the relationship between the mainlanders' islanders' memories were like contradicting to each other. But in my paper, I actually shows that this might not be the case. So first of all, the memories about World War II and the Korean War, they were somehow related to each other since they worked together to construct an imagined community based on a shared memory about the past, and of course, the shared goal of the future. I will tell a little bit about that later. And the second thing is that the relations between the Chinese nationalists, or the mainlanders, and the islanders' memories about World War II, they were not entirely contradicting to each other. Actually, the mainlanders and islanders, they worked together in the process of producing and suppressing their memories that could be useful or even harmful to construct a shared memory about the past. And I use a term called unintentional collaboration to refer to this kind of unorganized cooperation between the mainlanders and islanders, since it was never their intention to cooperate with each other, even though they end up of doing so. And the ultimate goal of this kind of collaboration is to construct a shared memory and therefore build an imagined community. So let's move to the memories about Taiwanese Imperial Japanese settlement shortly after the war, and especially during the 1950s. So shortly after the war, from the year of 1945 to 1947, there was law against the so-called Hanjian. It's called Hanjian 审判条例. And Hanjian actually means the traitors of Chinese Hans. And there were also trials, of course, against the so-called war criminals. So for a lot of islanders who used to like fought or even serve for the Japanese, they might choose to silence and keep their past in secret, since they don't want to get themselves into trouble, even brought to trial. But there were also islanders trying to exonerate their behavior or activities during the war by arguing that, hey, they were actually forcefully conscripted by the Japanese against their will. So therefore, they should not be considered as Hanjian or even brought to trial as war criminals, since they were no less, they suffered no less than their Chinese compatriots. But this kind of attempt to exonerate those islanders temporarily fell to an end because of the February 28th incident happening in the 1947. And another attempt to exonerate the islanders' behavior during the war would come up again in the news of rescuing Taiwanese prisoner of war from Manus Island in the year of 1951 to 56. So as you can see in this picture, the Manus Island is northern to the Papua New Guinea, and it was controlled by Australia and used the island to build a camp to imprison those so-called war criminals on there. And there was around 89 to 74 Taiwan origin prisoner of war imprisoned on the island during that time. So here is one news article, again, from the Central Daily News, published in the year 1951, regarding the Taiwanese war criminals imprisoned on the island. And at the bottom of this news article, there is one letter written by an unknown author, but I believe that author should be like an islanders. And the title of the letter is called A Letter for Those Who Were Imprisoned on Manus Island. And here's a quote of it. On the island of Manus, there are 200 so-called war criminals who are our Taiwanese compatriots. We have been colonized by the Japanese for 50 years, and we were forced to fight for the Japanese. So we became a part of fatherland 5 years ago, but why there are compatriots among those war criminals? So we means islanders, of course, shall rescue and bring you back. The you means those war criminals or prisoners of war to Taiwan, since we shall or we will defeat the Chinese communists in the future. So from this letter written by an unknown author, who I believe is an islander, to those imprisoned on the island of Manus, there are several interesting we can find here. First one, it seems that there is a shift of description from describing those imprisoned Taiwanese on the island from war criminals to the prisoner of war. And therefore, this way they can exonerate and make these people more, these people's experience grievable to not only the islanders, but also the mainlanders readers. Secondly, they also inherit the description or the terminology discourse from the 1945 to 1947 by describing those Taiwanese soldiers as the forcibly conscripted soldier, and they suffer no less than their Chinese compatriots in the mainland, and especially after the war, since the situation and environment on the island of Manu is quite dire. So therefore, they should not be considered as war criminals, but one of them or one of their compatriots, they were the most pitiful compatriots, 最可怜的同胞. Therefore, they should be bring back to Taiwan. So in this way, we can see that both the mainlanders, I mean, Central Daily News is a newspaper controlled tightly by the Chinese nationalists and run by the mainlanders. They actually work together to construct a shared memory about the past, which is the World War II, and of course, a shared goal of the future, which is the anti-communist effort. Since the islanders argue that if we can bring them back, they could be contributed to the anti-communist effort in the future. And a similar strategy also shows in the case of Taiwanese soldiers who were captured in the Korean War. So like what I said at the beginning of my presentation, Chen Yonghua, he was actually one of the PVSPO prisoner of wars, and there were actually more than 21,000 of them. But among them, there were actually 3 Taiwan origin prisoners of war. The first one is Chen Yonghua. Second one is Wang Yingchang, who was born in the island of Tonghu and who also decided to be repatriated back to Taiwan. And last one is Chen Qingbin, who was born in Yilan County and decided to go to China and die there during the Cultural Revolution. So since we do have 2 Taiwanese or Taiwan origin prisoners of war decided to go back to Taiwan, the reason why Chen Yonghua was known as the only Taiwanese anti-communist hero remain unknown. I don't know why. But what we know from the description from the news articles and interviews of Chen Yonghua shows us that, first of all, choosing an islander who were forcibly conscripted by the communists and fighting wars that he didn't want to actually make these guys experience grievable to not only to the mainlander, but also the islanders readers living on the island at that time, and making this somehow remote war in Korean Peninsula more grievable to the islanders readers. Secondly, aside from describing Chen Yonghua as a passive and miserable conscripted soldier by the communists who forced him to fight for the war, the news article during that time also described Chen Yonghua as an active and valiant defector and a possible fighter against the Chinese communists, since there were a lot of reports arguing that Chen Yonghua was more than willing to devote himself to the anti-communist effort in the future. So in this way, we can see that a quite similar strategy of try to integrate the experience of islanders into the official discourse of not only the memories about World War II, but also the memory about Korean War by constructing a shared memory about the past and of course a shared goal of the future. So in conclusion, first of all, I'm repeating myself. The historical memories about Korean War and World War II, they were somehow related to each other, not separated, because they worked together to construct an imagined community based on shared memory about the past, which is World War II and Korean War. And of course, the shared goal of the future, which is to fight against the communists. Second, the relations between the Chinese nationalists or the mainlanders and the islanders' memories about World War II, they were not contradicting to each other at all. Actually, both the mainlanders and islanders worked together to construct a shared memory about the past in the process of producing the suppressing. And they actually did so in a manner I called unintentional collaboration. That's the end of my presentation today. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. And your unintentional collaboration, 1 minute and 20 seconds left to spare. Very complicated and very moving topic in many ways. So I think I look forward to discussing it. Our next presentation is, it's already up here by James Garian. Is it Garian or Garian? Garrington from the University of Florida, The Long Lives of Old Customs in colonial time, there's a subtitle as well, isn't there?
That involves the
Japanese person you're writing about.
Santarō and something.
Okay. At any rate, you can give the subtitle, and you're on when you're ready.
So thank you, Dr. Katz, for that introduction. And I will just sort of be trying to introduce my research on my topic, which is really sort of not really my principal interest right now. It's sort of something that I've kept on the back burner for a while. So I thought that I would use this opportunity really as a chance to pitch sort of a new idea to a captive audience, or for whom, for reasons that I'll discuss, I think this topic is quite of interest for a number of reasons. So the paper really is a preliminary attempt, as I mentioned, to write a history of the practical and the intellectual concerns of a research project that was undertaken by the Japanese colonial government in the first 20 years of colonial rule on Taiwan. This project involved the very kind of famous investigation of what they called old customs, in Japanese kyukan or in Chinese jokuan, and use these customs, codify them as the basis of the colonial legal system. The reason I'm kind of using these scare quotes is because I hope to kind of show that I really treat custom as kind of a category of analysis and not really sort of a transparent object. The research project, the publications that followed, really, especially most famously, Taiwan private law, in Japanese Taiwan Shiho, or in Chinese Taiwan Sifa, are relatively well known, I would say, in the Taiwan history field, also relatively well known in the kind of broader among historians of late imperial China, the Japanese Empire, anthropology, really for reasons that I hope to explain. I'll provide a brief history of the project and its director, Okamatsu Santarō, in just a second. But before I do so, I'd just like to share the reasons that I became interested in this topic to sort of help to clarify why it is that I am sort of coming back to this after some time away from it. So this paper really emerged from three interrelated observations. First was just a historian's archival discovery during a fieldwork stay in Japan in 2016. I noticed that the papers of the project's director, Okamatsu Santarō, Chinese characters for his name are Gangzong Cantailang, had been recently archived at Waseda University. Second, I just sort of completed my qualifying examinations, a field that a number of my co-panelists have mentioned that they have just been at. And I noticed that Taiwan Shiho, Taiwan Sifa was really all over the bibliographies, the footnotes of a number of kind of corpora of texts that I had been reading. Late imperial and republican Chinese legal history, late imperial and republican Chinese economic history, so the social and economic history of colonial and late Qing Taiwan, and then of course kind of anthropology. So I was really wondering, it became sort of an obsession of mine to ask myself, how could one text kind of be called to speak for and called to speak to really all of these different fields? What was the nature of this publication, Taiwan Shiho, and how did it take shape over the 20 years of the commission's research? And finally, I noticed Okamatsu's relationship with Goto Shinpei, who's probably the most famous colonial bureaucrat in the history of colonial Taiwan. He served in the civil administration under the Governor General Kurama Gentaro, who was the Governor General from 1898 to 1906. And he really appears in every single history of colonial Taiwan. Another thing that I realized from having just read a lot in the field, alongside two kind of really famous aphorisms. One is where he identifies the so-called 1,000 years of living history in Taiwan, by which he did not mean that Taiwan had a very long history, but rather that there were people at different sort of stages of development that could be divided by thousands of years, all living together sort of simultaneously, but not coevally on the same island. The second kind of concept that's always associated with him or quoted alongside mention of him is the idea that the colonial rule in Taiwan should be informed by biological principles or biological laws. And I was curious that even though I had known so much or read so much, been kind of just constantly reading about Goto Shinpei, how is it that I never really heard about Okamatsu Santarō, and really how was his role as a legal scholar part of creating these ideas, right, that colonial rule in Taiwan should be scientific? What did that mean? Creating this idea of there being thousands of years of history on this island. So this paper really, I have been thinking about it really as a broader kind of question, really that's located at the intersection of these three observations. First is the kind of classic historian's archival discovery. The second is this sort of source-based overlap between different kind of historiographical fields. And finally, the kind of history of colonial Taiwan, the degree to which it kind of drew on these legal customs, not just as a product of this colonial investigation, but as the kind of basis for justifying colonial rule in Taiwan to begin with. And so the questions that I'm trying to ask that I will not at all get to answering today really are, how are the government generals' kind of goals of legal, fiscal, and social form related? How did these goals really shape the very, very urgent goals of fiscal and legal and social reform? How did they shape the Commission's process of collecting data and producing knowledge about late Qing Taiwan? Why did they call this policy biological? And more importantly, perhaps, why is it that so many people kind of in the aftermath, latter-day historians have taken them sort of at their word? And so really bringing together a number of these observations, I did notice, I don't have time to talk about this today, that if you do go through Okamatsu's archive, you will notice draft papers for what eventually became Goto's famous speeches about the basis of scientific rule. And so I knew that I was sort of on to something. My idea was that I would investigate Okamatsu's personal papers, really to try to answer the question of how it is that this body of knowledge produced about late Qing Taiwan, early colonial Taiwan, came to serve as such a reliable picture, really, of how things were in late Qing Taiwan. And not just Taiwan specifically, but really late imperial society writ large. And this was the kind of conscious goal of Japanese colonial administrators and researchers, but also sort of became the way that latter-day historians, like I've mentioned, economic historians, anthropologists, have tended to use this body of research. So there's a pretty obvious and relatively simple answer to this last question. Post-war historians around the world, not just in Taiwan or Japan, but really across the Pacific, they tended to rely on Okamatsu's publications, at least I think. I'm curious what everyone else might think, because they were simply sort of what was available, right? Either because they were comprehensive and really tens of thousands of pages if you've never seen Taiwan Siva before, or because of, for people especially interested in late imperial Chinese society kind of more broadly, and Taiwan as a kind of gateway into that, local archives on the mainland were either kind of inaccessible or non-existent for a number of decades. And so anyone who's tried to read Taiwan Sufa, and I had to kind of return to this for this presentation, can't deny that this research group was, if nothing else, extremely, extremely comprehensive, extremely prodigious in the kind of collection of information, its codification over the course of 2 decades. So then my question sort of becomes, why is it important, or really is it important? And I'm curious kind of what everyone thinks, because I'm not really settled on this question myself. Is it important to consider the process by which his research took shape? From the first early drafts handwritten in 1900, 1901, until Taiwan private law was kind of eventually codified and published throughout the 1910s. How did this change really from the early years of drafting to the final years of publication? How was it systematized? How did it come to speak not just for Taiwan as a whole? Was Taiwan this place, a kind of self-evident unit of analysis, but more generally, and as the Japanese kind of investigators themselves professed, speak on behalf of really all of kind of China, defined in historical and cultural terms. And then to kind of bring this to the post-war, which I also don't think I'll have time to talk about today, kind of history of this process of knowledge production kind of tell us as much about the colonial period, the early 20th century in Taiwan and East Asia more generally, as the post-war period. Like, why is it that this knowledge has proven to be so kind of durable? So there are a number of, I guess, downsides for presenting on the last day of a conference, but kind of one benefit is that I can consider my research in light of what others have mentioned kind of so far. And I really look forward to kind of the topic of this panel, because I think there's a lot of overlap in what we are trying to do or the questions we're trying to ask. I've heard kind of repeatedly that the historical question of kind of Taiwan studies, what does it mean to study Taiwan, and what larger kind of unit is it called to speak on behalf of? A lot of questions about Taiwan studies being a kind of marginalized part or mere subset of China studies. This has a long kind of post-war history, but kind of what I'm interested in here is also how this has a pre-war, early 20th century kind of antecedent. So my interest here is not really to provide a normative answer to this question, whether or not Taiwan should or should not kind of be called to speak on behalf of China more generally, but to rather to make this a historical question. How is it that these Japanese investigators thought that what they were doing was really meant to speak on behalf of China more generally, and have those assumptions been sort of baked into what they wrote? Was Taiwan itself unique? Obviously, everyone has their own personal kind of answers to that question, but what did these individuals think, and how did that answer kind of shape how they undertook their research? Was it really, like I've mentioned, a kind of self-contained unit? Did it make sense kind of as a place? And this, of course, came up in a number of contexts, but even in the publishing panel, even last night at dinner when people were talking about the kind of AES forcing Taiwan papers to fall under the China panel, right? And so this is a question that is not just a personal and professional one that kind of affects our everyday lives, but also was one that was really weighing on the Japanese investigators that I'm interested in. So I will just sort of move forward here and talk briefly about Okamatsu and the project, and then briefly about the different kinds of sources that they were interested in. Okamatsu Santarō was born in 1871, Miyazaki Prefecture in Kyushu. He's the third son of a Confucian scholar whose name was Okamatsu Yokoku, who worked closely with scholars interested in legal reform jurisprudence in Hiji domain. He himself spent years in his youth, 1896 to 1899, at Berlin University, which is now the Humboldt, which is considered at the time kind of one of the preeminent centers for legal science. Here he was at the center of debates that were happening not just in Japan, but also kind of around the world, and especially in Germany more generally, and whether legal codes and the process of legal codification should draw on what they considered to be customary practices again, of ordinary people, or whether they should sort of follow a more universal definition of law. Could the French Civil Code be applied writ large to Japan, or should there be a process of identifying custom as the basis of law? So all of this is really at the forefront of Okamatsu's mind in particular, but just sort of in the air when he and the research team reached Taiwan in the early 20th century. So I'll refer to them, this research team, generally as the commission, and this follows the Japanese name, the Temporary Commission, or the Provisional Commission for the Investigation of Old Custom. So given his involvement in these sort of debates, given this is part of his training, his education, it's hardly surprising that there were debates also about the kinds of sources that they should use to study this so-called custom. And so if you look through the table of contents of the commission's main journal, Taiwan Kanshu Kiji, or records of Taiwan customs, a few things stand out. One thing that emerges very quickly is records of interviews with native informants. These are obviously highly staged, right? They usually take the form of speaking about a specific topic. Here it's talking about bandits. Again, I'm using scare quotes. This is kind of anti-Japanese ongoing military resistance. And sometimes the informants are named. In the case of question of corporations or trusts, Kanshu Kiji mentions Li Chunseng, who was a really famous kind of camphor merchant a tea and camphor merchant in the late Qing period. And sometimes they don't name the informant at all. Here it's just sort of a reformed bandit. I'm going to skip over kind of talking about this. This is the kind of most obvious kind of ethnographic turn, which is a really big epistemological shift also in what we see in terms of data collection. So a lot of their debates about what kind of sources should be the basis of custom have to do with obviously practical concerns, right? What was available, what had been destroyed during the Sino-Japanese War, but of course also what they themselves really wanted to find, and about certain assumptions about their relationship between codified law and customary practice. So Okamatsu highlighted this kind of tension in an early publication. This is translated into English. According to the legal conception of these days, it seems the code was to be followed as a fundamental principle, but the event of a local custom clashing with the terms of the code, the government granted leave to the officials to respect the custom rather than the code. This is speaking about the Qing local officials in Taiwan. The formation and development of so many customs among the people must have been due to the laxity of the Chinese government. So here we have a formed opposition of where custom emerges because the Qing government itself is lax or just disinterested. I'm going to skip now and talk just briefly about one specific article titled The Old Records of the Acculturated Barbarians in the Fengshan Area. This is written not by Okamatsu, but by another kind of famed anthropologist historian whose name is Ino Kanori, or Ineng Jiaju. And where this also very similarly to the other article I was mentioning, it talks about old records, documentary records, as the gateway to history of settlement in Fengshan, here involving the so-called plain aborigines, the acculturated barbarians, or the Siraya people, sort of depending on what term you want to use to classify this publication. And so in this context, he talks about contracts, he talks about the documentary record as really a way to access this history of Chinese attempts to so-called take advantage of their being stupid and by nature and trick them, exchanging small amounts of liquor or cloth for large tracts of land, or taking advantage of their illiteracy to have them sign different kinds of contracts. So the existence of contracts here is sort of an index of this social Darwinist kind of competition between Chinese settlers and indigenous people. He quotes here, and this is sort of the last thing that I will mention, a letter from 1711 showing that the Qing officials in Taiwan were well aware of this phenomenon. Here it's a letter from the Zhulo prefect in Kangxi 1711, where he writes, or quotes this prefect writing to the Minze governor. In recent years, migrants have increased by the day, defining territory and encroaching on the barbarians' lands. They apply for cultivation permits or occupy the barbarians' hunting grounds and fields. Indeed, possessions, or that pass down through the generations can only maintain one family out of 10,000. How much blood and flesh do barbarians have, though they do not wish to see exhausted? Is this possible? Now all harms are gone and the barbarians' many sufferings settled. I'll wrap up really quickly by just mentioning that if you trace this, it goes all the way back to Huang Zhujing's Taihai Sisalu from 1722. And Ino has actually done a really creative thing where he's omitted a major portion in the middle of the text, which is about the Qing government's desire to see these indigenous people really as tax-paying subjects. So it's examples like this that I'm using to try to ask myself, well, why is it that Ino himself would be downplaying the tax-paying relationship between the Sirai people and the Qing local official? What kind of purpose does it serve? And ultimately, what kind of image of the Qing government and local Qing officials in the Kangxi period does it leave us with if we are to rely on this quotation that does end up being reproduced kind of unedited into Taiwan Sifa in the 1910s. So I'll just wrap up there and I can answer any other questions that I'm sure remain from my kind of abridged presentation during the Q&A. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. This is a fascinating presentation. It's related to a little bit to what I was doing when I wrote my Divine Justice book about how law was supposed to be defined and applied. And so we can talk about that a little bit later in the Q&A as well. The third presentation is Li Bin-yi or Pin-yi? Pin? Okay, Li Pin-yi from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Talking about national history museums in the making, negotiating the contemporary Taiwanese identity. We really should have Zhang Longzhi as the discussion of this paper, not me, but he's not here, so I will just have to channel him later. But the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ping Li from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm presenting the proposed research framework of my dissertation fieldwork, National History Museums in the Making, Negotiating the Contemporary Taiwanese Identity. First, I discussed the news articles that motivated me in conducting the research. Second, I contextualized the selected national museums and their uniqueness in the shaping of Taiwan's national building. Third, I connect my research to some Western museum theories and Taiwan studies. Next, I introduce my research methods and questions and give more specific context for the museums with some initial observations of their museum displays. Finally, I summarize the importance of conducting a contemporary multi-sided museum ethnography in Taiwan. On July 17, 2018, Taiwan News reported the new appointment of the National Palace Museum's director, Qinan Chen, and his reinterpretation of the museum's dominant collections originally from China with the term Taiwanization. Eventually, his reference to Taiwanization for the management of the National Palace Museum appeared to be controversial. Meanwhile, his announcement of making the southern branch of the National Palace Museum a place for the broad Asian context is clearly against the former Chinese ideology that the National Palace Museums espoused. Some questions emerged immediately after I read this article. First, how can a museum that is vividly a Chinese collection repository be Taiwanized? Also, how does the so-called Asian cultural context mitigate the dominant Chinese ideology shown in the museum exhibitions? In fact, one day before the previous news, Liberty Times Net reported an interview with the director of the National Museum of History, Xin Liao. In the interview, Dr. Liao differentiates the distinctive positions between the National Museum of History and the National Museum of Taiwan History. The former is also a product of the KMP's ruling in Taiwan, just like the National Palace Museum, and the later is a project carried out by the current DP government. Liao claims that the National Museum of History attends to a sense of high culture by emphasizing cultural continuity from the mainland to Taiwan, while the recently built National Museum of Taiwan History focuses on locally collected folklore objects. Nevertheless, he urges the two museums to work together in representing Taiwan's cultural diversity through the coexistence of Chinese tradition and Taiwanese identity. His ambitious and inclusive remarks, however, do not offer precise definitions of Taiwanese and Chinese culture that will be helpful for clarifying their cultural boundaries and overlap in museums. So my proposed 6 research sites consist of the National Taiwan Museum, the National Palace Museum and its southern branch, the National Museum of History and National Museum of Taiwan History, and the National Museum of Prehistory. This selection is a result of preliminary evaluation of their historical comprehensiveness in exhibiting the national history and the high-level position they occupy in the governmental system. I avoid choosing museums that target only one specific ethnic group's history, although the National Museum of Prehistory is a crucial witness to Taiwanese indigenous people's cultural history, together with the museum's concentration on the archaeological excavations in understanding the national prehistory that is essential for building the narratives of national history. Compared to other countries that are frequently devoted to the making of one single national museum, Taiwan has a diversified museumscape within which several national history museums thrive with different historical narratives or topical focuses. For example, the KMT government preserves the National Taiwan Museum, originally built by the Japanese colonialists, alongside their newly established National Museum of History and National Palace Museum. More recently, the current DPP government has carried on the tradition of the National History Museum and National Palace Museum, or those museums rooted in Chinese ideology, while incorporating their own ideology of Taiwanization through the long-term renovation of the original exhibitions. Even in the unique case of the US, the Smithsonian, acting in a similar fashion to national museums, does run multiple national museums that detail different ethnic groups' history and cultural. However, it is rare to see national history museums coexist for their common mission to contain the comprehensive history of one country. As a unique cluster of cultural representations of Taiwanese history and political views, the National History Museums in Taiwan are ideal cultural institutions for analyzing the process of national identity making through the exhibitions, collections, and public programs. In an earlier presentation, I mentioned the previous discussions on national museums and post-colonial museums. To summarize, some museums are political, performative, and imaginative sites for nation states to discipline their citizens. As a crucial index of colonial projects, national museums as post-colonial museums are important for national identity making. However, museums in Taiwan do not entirely correspond to the Western theoretical critiques of museums. For example, Pierre Bourdieu discusses how museums are the taste cultivation space for the elite class, allowing them to accumulate the necessary cultural capital. This idea is not quite suitable for comprehending the early development of Taiwan's museums. According to Taiwanese museum scholar Ji Rongzhu, the diverse origin of museums in the Western world is not useful when considering Taiwan's museum projects, which have been mostly government that since the Japanese colonial era. Additionally, the museums in Taiwan are educational institutions instead of channels for the upper class to accrue cultural capital. Although identity is a keyword in Taiwan studies, I note a lack of empirical research on how Chineseness is actively being repositioned through Taiwan's contemporary designification projects, including in studies of its national museums. Meanwhile, another 2 articles are relevant for reflection. In the post-war era, Shao Xingchen states that Taiwan is the laboratory for studying Chinese society and culture. If this statement is no longer accurate for understanding contemporary Taiwan, how do most of the national history museums alter the statement by emphasizing more local narratives and elements that are not considered Chinese? And also, if Chinese remains an unavoidable component not only in the makeup of collections but also in the exhibitions, how is Chinese heritage being represented in those Taiwanese history museums? In other words, when the national museums claim to dedicate themselves to documenting Taiwanese culture and history, it is important to bear in mind that the museums are situated in the post-colonial context. Thus, acknowledging the latent existence of the Japanese and Chinese visitors is necessary. In fact, Wei Yili's observation on how Japanese colonialism, Chinese nationalism, and Taiwanese localism are important to the making of Taiwan's multiple national history museums is suitable to contextualize my proposed research. I will visit the representative Taiwanese national museums, focusing on observing the permanent exhibitions and their related public programs as they reflect the museum's long-term text compared to the special exhibitions. I will also interview the museum directors, curators, the target audience, and the docents. In terms of the target audience, although I do not have the demographical information of the museum's attendees, the museums indicate the intended audience on their official websites by providing the translations such as English, Southeast Asian languages, Japanese, Korean, and some other Western languages to imply the origins of most of their international visitors. These museums usually install an interactive room for children and school students, which shows that the museums are aware of educating future generations. With the research plan, I intend to answer the following questions. First, in the sense of the Taiwanization, how do museums diminish the former heavy emphasis on colonial history and attend to the local Taiwanese culture and history? Second, as Taiwan's national museums diversify, how are their discussions of Taiwanese similar or different? Third, how does a contemporary anthropological understanding of national museums in Taiwan help foster a constructive relationship between museums and their communities? For example, anthropologist James Clifford's picture of museums as contact zones is clear in the case of Taiwan, as the colonizers of Japan and China and the colonized meet in the galleries. Also, a national museum in Taiwan would be an interesting case study of the nation that interacts with the members of the imagined communities by concerning various social relationships in the museums. Originally built by Japanese colonizers, the National Taiwan Museum has transformed from a colonial project into a local project, featuring the natural history of Taiwan. The permanent exhibitions at the museum are Discovering Taiwan, Taiwan Our Home, which is a children's exhibition, and Exploring Taiwan. I've argued in another presentation that the Discovering Taiwan exhibition engages the Japanese anthropologists' work in Taiwan during the colonial period for reinterpretations. By acknowledging those scholars' contribution to the formation of early knowledge of Taiwan, the exhibition is an interesting venue to examine how Japanese colonization is viewed in the contemporary sense. Based on the content of the exhibition, the curators tend to give positive evaluations of the Japanese colonial period. Together with the National Palace Museum, the National Museum of History has been criticized for its relatedness to the local Taiwanese culture, acting as a repository of Chinese art collections. Thus, a transformation project is deemed necessary by the DPP government to make it more relevant to the Taiwanese audience. However, due to the ongoing renovation, the museum building is not open to the public until the end of next year. Nevertheless, the museum is collaborating with other museums to exhibit its valuable collections. For example, one of the southern branch of the National Palace Museum's permanent exhibitions contains Buddhist objects that are originally from China, which are included in Taiwan's national collections. When introducing the cultural context, it is Buddhism's origin in India that is stressed instead of the origin of this specific collection from China. Another collaboration exhibition between the museum and the Museum of Institute of History and Philology in Academia Sinica is about ancient China, attempting to open a window to the diversities of the Eastern Zhou, which showcase the Chineseness that the museum possesses in terms of its collections and their understanding of which local museum value to properly collaborate with for the display. As mentioned, the position of the National Past Museum is tricky as it continues to be purely Chinese political ideological manifestation established upon the PMP's retreat to Taiwan. The current permanent exhibitions are unable to avoid showing the Chinese culture behind those Chinese artifacts. However, some strategies have been employed to make the objects or displays less referential to China. For example, the introductions to multiple permanent exhibitions do not include China in the exhibition titles, and some display technologies are employed in the permanent exhibitions or of other Chinese collections that attempt to lessen the heavy emphasis on Chineseness and to stress the perspective of aesthetics. Thus, I argue that the strategy of the politicizing is blended into the exhibitions. Due to the ongoing localization project, the National Museum of Prehistory is also undergoing renovation and reopened last Saturday. Compared to the National Museum of History, which is also closed for remodeling, the museum has put more effort into setting up online exhibitions for long-term use. Most of the online exhibitions are open access until the end of 2031. The exhibitions target mostly the indigenous peoples in Taiwan. Meanwhile, there is an exhibition linking Taiwan with the neighboring Southeast Asian countries. This effort in including neighboring countries is similarly found in the southern branch of the National Past Museum. One of the National Museum of Taiwan History's permanent exhibitions is named Our Land, Our People, The Story of Taiwan, which is divided into 7 sections by historical period. Besides the permanent and special exhibitions, there is a VR history recreated room for the audience to visit history through the technological immersion in historical time and space. The museum attempts to politicize the historical moment, trying to give the visitors a chance to interpret how the rules of Japan and the Chinese colonial government, as well as the local Taiwanese, play respectively in the shaping of local history. The southern branch of the National Past Museum is a governmental project to utilize the higher level cultural institutions to balance the regional developmental gap. Located in central Taiwan, the museum brings the treasures from the National Past Museum in Taipei to encourage local participation in museum venues.
1 minute left.
Okay. As well as emphasizes the Chinese political ideologies in the exhibitions. Meanwhile, the permanent exhibitions not only showcase the Chineseness, but also displays the local culture in Jiayi, as well as Taiwan's potential connections with the Southeast and South Asian regions. In a similar fashion to the National Past Museum, we do not sense China in their naming, although the major content is still the Chinese collections in the permanent exhibitions. Conclusions. Taiwan's relationship with China and other neighboring countries is so complex that the process of linking the Taiwanese identity with Taiwan's international participation needs to be concretized. National museums could be one of the venues for observing this intricacy. I have argued that Taiwan adopts a more diversified role to establishing its national history museums. Further, I observe that the two strategy of depoliticizing in the National Past Museum and politicizing in the National Museum of Taiwan History with the use of modern technologies reflect the unique relocation of Taiwanese culture and Taiwanese awareness of differentiating Taiwan and China. Finally, the museumscape in Taiwan is expected to not only reveal the special political status of Taiwan, but also create a novel visualization and imagination of the thriving Taiwanese cultural identity emphasized in Taiwan studies. For the future Taiwan studies, I suggest that by combining the research on the national history museums to strategically look at how Taiwan is and should be working toward the continuity and discontinuity of Japaneseness or Chineseness in the making of Taiwaneseness. Thank you very much for listening.
Hey, well done. And last but not least, we have Louis from the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, Political Archives in Taiwan and their Afterlives. And it looks interesting, and I appreciate the use of the plural, which I think is also needed in some of the other paper titles, but you're on.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind introduction. So Taiwan is often hailed as a bastion of democracy in East Asia, but its track record in transition justice has been less impressive instead. Since the end of the martial law, successive administrations have issued official apologies, compensated former victims, and has built a new landscape of public memorials. But unlike many other newly democratic societies, there are no public trials, no vetting of former officials, and until recently, limited opening of former archives. As one scholar put it, Taiwan is a country with only victims and no perpetrators. How do I switch? There you go. This lackluster pursuit of transitional justice changed dramatically in 2016 when the DPP took control of both the presidency and the legislative for the first time. Since then, the DPP has introduced a spate of new laws to reckon with Taiwan's past dictatorship. A new Transitional Justice Commission was founded, the KMT party assets were seized, and popular monuments of Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo were renamed. Amongst all of these initiatives, the opening of political archives looms as one of the most consequential changes. For former victims and their families, the opening of individual dossiers brings closure and discloses truth about state responsibility and collective complicity. For scholars, this archival gold rush has given us unprecedented insight into the inner workings of an authoritarian state, opening new research avenues on century-old questions such as state capacity and surveillance. And finally, for Taiwan society as a whole, the opening of archives would be an essential lesson in civic education, one that would help it strengthen its unique identity. Indeed, as President Tsai Ing-wen said at the 73rd anniversary of the February 28 incident, a society willing to face history and seek truth will not be torn apart by what it learns. Rather, it is such courage to confront our past mistakes that will strengthen our democracy and make our society freer and more diverse. Truth, justice, memory. President Tsai's speech was pitch perfect, but it was also somewhat tone deaf to the tenor of domestic politics. Instead of deepening social healing, the declassification of archives has instead opened a new front in partisan politics, with both the GMD and the DPP accusing each other of weaponizing transitional justice for their own political gains. So in my presentation today, I would like to examine the fraught politics of archival opening in Taiwan today by focusing on two questions. Firstly, given Taiwan's relatively successful democratization, why has it taken so long to open the archives, especially when it's compared to other new democracies? And secondly, despite talks of social healing and remembrance, why has the opening of archives remained such a contentious and divisive issue? To answer these questions, I will begin with an overview of political archives as a distinct category of analysis. Then I will address the three ongoing obstacles to the opening of archives, namely national security, personal privacy, and historical truths. And finally, I will reflect on how to approach political archives as a historical subject. Now, archive is a loaded term. The openness of a country's archives is often seen as an index of its democracy. Though true to a certain extent, this popular imagination of archives overlooks the ambivalent meanings. In my presentation today, rather than equating archival openness with transparency, I want to show how the opening of political archives revealed more nuances of complicity and accountability. Now, but what do we talk about when we talk about political archives? At first sight, this term itself is somewhat redundant. After all, as the recent archival turn in scholarship suggests, archives are not passive repositories of truth, but tools of power. Every step in a file's life cycle, from what is written down to what is accessioned and preserved to what is declassified to the general public, is shaped by power. So in a way, all archives are political archives. In the case of Taiwan, however, this concept has a more specific and narrower legal definition. According to the 2009 Political Archives Act, political archives are those that pertain to political repression, and they have a specific start date, which is August 15th, 1945, when the GMD began its rule on the island, and an end date, of November 6, 1992, when Lee Teng-hui officially abolished the martial law. So within Taiwan's documentary landscape, Political Archives looms as one of the most voluminous and consequential collections. They cover multiple genres, ranging from surveillance dossiers, investigation files, to routine bureaucratic records. They span a wide variety of agencies, from official bureaucracies to party organizations. But despite this impressive scope and breadth, one could also argue that this official periodization of political archives is also too narrow. After all, the chronology neglects injustices committed under Japanese colonial rule, and it also overlooks the fact that many of the key institutions responsible for authoritarian repression, such as the Ministry of Justice Investigation Bureau, were already created in China when the GMD was in power on the mainland, and that the Chinese Communist Party also inherited this system and created a parallel system of political archives to identify political enemies in the 1950s. So in existing debates about political archives, archives also often evoked as a source of historical truth, one that will reveal the darkest secrets of the state. But archives have their own histories. They were not just a byproduct of authoritarian bureaucracy, but played an essential role in KMT regime consolidation and state building in the early 50s and 60s. So one of the greatest challenges of retooling Taiwan's political archives is to precisely challenge this logic of national security. How can the former instruments of terror and repression and surveillance be transformed into tools of truth? This challenge was not just about identifying specific groups or collections of records, but changing the political culture inside the bureaucracy more generally. And this task remains difficult, especially given the ongoing and deepening tension between China and Taiwan. For instance, the National Security Bureau cited the Classification National Security Information Protection Act when refusing to transfer some of its archives to the National Archives, claiming that the declassification of archives would divulge sources of intelligence and damage intelligence operations, thereby jeopardizing Taiwan's national security interests. And even among the files that it turned over to the National Archive, there was substantial redaction, as we see here, and many files would not be accessible to the general public for another few decades. Now, is national security being used as a pretext to cover up official wrongdoing? With many of the archives still inaccessible to scholars, it is difficult to render a definitive judgment. But part of the challenge comes from Taiwan's overlapping and sometimes competing legal landscape regarding archival declassification. For instance, the Political Archives Act gave public access to full names, aliases, code names, and job titles of former civil servants and informants in political archives, whereas the Article 8 of the National Intelligence Work Act suggested that they could be held secret. So far, I have discussed the difficulty in finding a just balance between transparency and security, but that was only the first hurdle. After all, political archives were created with a single purpose: to identify enemies of the state, and they did so by ingesting vast amounts of information from a dense and varied field of social relations. And indeed, for many former victims and the descendants, reading their former selves in these files was a gut-wrenching experience. As part of a pilot access scheme, a select group of victims and the descendants have been invited to read their surveillance records. Some of these testimonies, which have been captured in a series of public documentaries, are deeply personal and poignant. For instance, Ms. Zheng Zhumei, the daughter of Zheng Nanrong, a former editor of a dissent journal who burned himself to death, talked about how she came to know about his father through his file. She didn't know, for instance, that her own father had brown eyes. Her testimony testified to the centrality of social relations in political surveillance. Terror and violence are without doubt key institutions of KMT rule, but the longevity of its governance in Taiwan also relied on the complicity of thousands of ordinary Taiwanese who became volunteers, informers, and agents of social control, whether willingly or unwillingly. Now, this density of personal information inside the file shows that authoritarian rule was profoundly social, but it also raises an important question: what should be done with all these personal details? While it is universally agreed upon that the declassification of political archives must balance transparency with privacy so as not to cause secondary harm to new agents, to former victims, how to do so remains difficult. It is not enough to remove only the most obvious information, such as a person's ID number, addresses, or biography, but removing all of these references to personal details would not only defeat the purpose of transparency and openness, at worst, a present-day archivist would risk reproducing the logic of surveillance and authoritarian rule. Now, how to declassify surveillance records is not just an ethical debate, but also a pragmatic challenge. As of April 2021, some 7.4 million pages of political archives have been digitized, but only some 10% of them have been made available to the public. In order to release them, archivists need to read a file page by page, to correct catalog entries, and to remove identifying information regarding an individual. At the current pace, going through an additional 10 million pages of political archives would take 68 years. So protecting individual privacy, therefore, has its own costs. For many victims of political violence in Taiwan today are already advanced in their age. Further delaying the opening of archives would be a denial of justice to them. The official termination of Taiwan's Transitional Justice Commission in spring this year has only fueled concern about the future of archival opening. Without a high-profile agency advocating for the openness, will there be sufficient resources to sustain digitization and declassification of political archives? Now, only time will tell. For now, I would like to entertain a different proposition. Even when the archives are open, what truths can they offer? So far, the declassification of archives has led to the downfall of a few prominent politicians, such as Huang Guoshu, a DPP legislator who served as an informant. But outside these high-profile exposés, the opening of archives has produced few smoking guns. Take the example of the Lin family massacre in 1980. While the opening of archives has painted a devastating picture of state responsibility, definitive conclusions surrounding his death remains elusive. According to a recent study commissioned by the Transitional Justice Commission, we still don't know who ordered the operation, who were the assassins, and who covered their tracks. And even when the archives give us the real names, they do not always establish culpability. After all, there is no shortage of exaggerations, prevarications, and sometimes outright lies inside an archive. So, if the archives have gaps and cannot answer all of our questions, what can we do with them? The first thing we can do as scholars is to change our perspectives. As I suggested, instead of using archives as a source of truth on the past, we should treat them as a historical subject on their own right. And the second thing we could do, I think, is to approach the opening of archives not as an electoral promise, but as a social process. Recently, at the National Taiwan University, a team led by Professor Lin Guoming hosted a citizen conference which brought together some 20 attendees from across the country to collectively discuss the politics and practice of declassification. Who should have priority access? What kinds of personal information should be redacted? Should informers be publicly exposed and shamed? While the conference reached no clear consensus in the end, experiments as such demonstrate that the future of archival opening in Taiwan does not only require legislative initiatives from the very top. Instead, it should require sustained engagement within the community. Now, at a time when debates about transitional justice are increasingly polarized in Taiwan, we need more nuanced discussions about state responsibility and collective accountability. The voices that we cover from these archives are never clear sound bites. Instead, they produce more muddled, if not contradictory voices. And the opening of archives in Taiwan should not be the beginning of an end. Rather, it should be the start of a new process of social learning. And with that, I close my presentation and look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for 4 fascinating presentations. I left my cell phone up there, but we have about 25 minutes of time, I expect. Yep, 25 minutes. I'm going to offer a few brief comments. I'm going to open up to the floor for questions. If there's time for you to respond, okay, I'll give each of you a couple of minutes. If not, then you can just talk to your inquisitors. privately. I think, presenting is a learning experience, and so we have a lot of experts in the room. Let's hear what they have to say. Briefly, for Zheng Haowen, you use the idea of cooperative construction, but it's also unintentional collaboration, but also shared memory. It's a little bit hard for me to completely grasp. And you say, and imagined community. Why not use the plural of imagined communities? Why the emphasis that there's only sort of one shared memory being created and not diversified memories? That's just, and as for the letter from the Zhongyang Ribao, there is no proof that it's actually an island or a Benshengre. And some of the language, including referring to the Chinese Communists, seems to be more like what a mainlander would use. But at any rate, I still think, again, on the one hand, you say it's unintentional collaboration. You're actually presenting a very diverse set of views. Some of these remind me of David Chang's work on the Korean War. We talk about Hanjian. It reminds me of my colleague Luo Jiurong, who was retired but still active. But I'm still not quite sure about the emphasis on sort of, you say politics of historical memory. That would suggest diversity, but the title suggests unity. For James's paper, again, I did work on legal history and judicial rituals. And for me, of course, Matsuda Fukutaro's work was more important. Obviously, these surveys that you're talking about have been extensively studied, like Zheng Zhengcheng, and there's a whole book about them and everything. But I think that, it's just one form of colonial knowledge, knowledge as the basis for rule, while also embracing a certain form of legal pluralism. So is the process important? Yes. Is it important as to whether Taiwan represents China or not? I think that's not important in my mind. In my mind, what's important is how the knowledge is being created, and also to be aware of the fact that what should be considered law and what should be considered custom was also being debated in late Qing China at the very same time period. For example, would witnesses have to make oaths in court? That was being debated in late Qing China, and they eventually decided not to. So in some ways, actually, Western justice is more religious than Chinese justice. But anyway, for Li Pinyi's paper, again, first, I would take the negotiating the contemporary Taiwanese identity. I would take out the, and I would use negotiating contemporary Taiwanese identities, not just one identity. And you could compare this maybe to what's happened with textbooks, and also from my perspective, the Matsu cult, which is sometimes taken as representative of China, sometimes of Taiwan. And there's a recent book by a scholar named Hatfield that talks about sort of a creative collaboration where both sides agree to to have their own representations of Matsu, and they manage to get along despite the fact that one side is one idea and the other side is another idea. And I didn't quite understand your third question about fostering a constructive relationship. This is the anthropologist fostering a relationship with the museum, or the museum's fostering a constructive relationship with their audiences? I didn't quite understand that. For Louis' paper, transitional justice, why so divisive? It's always divisive. I mean, and all we have to do is watch the Trump hearings right now, and we'll get a sense of that. And it was, from my perspective, when you talk about things like justice delayed, it sometimes was difficult to separate the intellectual agenda from more advocacy. So I think you're going to be very careful about that. I would have liked to have seen them. I think you have some concerns here, and some of the terminology suggests a sort of dissatisfaction with how things have proceeded, and that's fine. But what's really interesting is because archives are political, transitional justice is divisive. And it's the same, and I don't think Taiwan is unique in that respect. And it also takes a heck of a long time to get it done. So I don't think, maybe it would be more interesting to sort of compare the situation to what's going on in other countries, and not to sort of use terms like justice delayed and things like that, which suggest a dissatisfaction with what's going on. But anyway, those are my personal points. Now I'll open up to the floor. People have questions. Who has questions? Okay, and please identify yourself too. You should come up here, right? Or actually, you don't need to, because should they come up?
We have microphones on.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Adina Zamanek from the University of Central Lancashire. I have a question for Li Pinyi. Thank you very much for the very engaging presentation of new trends in museum display and curating. I enjoyed that very much. I have two questions. I understand that these tendencies are towards diversification because they are replacing a Chinese framework with a plural idea of Taiwanese cultures. But I wonder if at this stage you could provide more information about the critical approach to, for example, the Japanese colonial era. Are there any efforts at decolonizing museum displays? That's my first question. The other question is whether we can speak of a depoliticization with regard to the Palace Museum, because from your presentation, what I saw was rather a very politicizing attempt to 去中国化 rather than to so that is the museum playing the role of ideological state apparatus constructing a Taiwanese national subject. So that has the effect of so should the museum do that, and should the museum, by doing that, also be obscuring the history of the collection itself of the National Palace Museum? Because that's obscuring the history of the collection, in my opinion. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Okay, we'll keep collecting questions. Who else has questions, please? And identify yourself as well.
Yeah, my question is, my comment and my question is Ting Hong Wong from Academia Sinica in Taiwan.
Okay.
And my question, my comment is for Dr. Lu. Yeah, and first of all, I know Dr. Lu is from mainland China, and he knows so well about Taiwan. It's make me scary. I'm kidding you. Don't take it serious. But basically my comment is same as Dr. K's comment. I think what you said about Taiwan is fascinating. But at the same time, I think it's quite expected. Yeah, I think archive, the process of opening archive is a political process. After opening the archive, we settle some questions that we create more questions. All this kind of thing, it seems to me is quite universal. And I agree with you. I think maybe you want to know, really capture this uniqueness of Taiwan, the uniqueness of Taiwan political archive. Maybe you have to do a comparative research. Compare, for instance, the case of Taiwan and East Germany, and see what's the difference in the two post-authoritarian regime when the archive become open. And compare the process, the political struggle. And then by doing so, you can be able to tell people more about the uniqueness of Taiwan.
Okay, other questions, please?
Thank you. My name is Denisa Hilbertova. I'm from the Masaryk University in Brno in the Czech Republic. And actually, my question is following up the previous question, and it's also directed to Dr. Lu, because I am actually from a country that experienced an authoritarian regime exactly in the similar time frame as Taiwan. And we are also in the stage of opening political archives. And it's actually starting to create a huge diversion within the society nowadays, because very often families find out that a member of their family was an informant and they had no idea of it. And so my question is actually, is there some kind of wider social response among the general Taiwanese public? Do they want the archives to be open, not just the victims, but generally? Or not, rather no.
Okay, so we can keep, all right, that's a question. Other questions? We still have plenty of time. Everybody take advantage of it. Going once, going twice? Okay, then we'll give each person 3 minutes to come up and respond. I won't be too strict for time. You won't be able to answer every single question, just address the ones you think are most pertinent. So, Alan, you go first. Emma, you stand at the podium, please.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Cates, for those important questions. I think all of them are pretty crucial to answer. So the first one is that the idea of unintentional collaboration. I believe that this term could be somehow misleading, but what I try to argue in my paper is that, first of all, it was never their intention, for both of the mainlanders, islanders to collaborate with each other, but somehow they ended up in a form close to collaboration. But it's of course, in an unorganized way. So for the second question is that you believe both the mainlanders and the islanders, they were actually trying to construct more than one immigrant communities. And I believe so, like for example, for mainlanders coming from different provinces, and then for the islanders coming from different ethnic groups, they were constructing their immigrant community, of course. But like if we take a look at like a more we'll say that more general or more broad perspective, the government and the governed is actually work together to construct the 中华民族神话, this kind of immigrant community after the war, and they did need the help from each other to do so, since we know that mainlanders just relocated their government to Taiwan, and they of course needed the support from the local population, as well as for the local population, they also need the promotion or the help from the government so they can get a better job or economic possibility. So for the last one is about the author of the later. Yes, there is no evidence showing that the author is islander or mainlander. In fact, of all, the entire news article is, we don't know the author of this news article, but from like the from the terminology used by the author of this later, it used we and us like islanders. And if we like consider other materials and sources published in other news articles, like published on newspaper published by Taiwanese or islanders, we can see that there is a like similar or close strategy taken by them to try to make those islanders prisoner of wars more integral. Their lives could be like integrated into the official discourse and try to like bring them back to Taiwan. So that's my short answer to your question. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It's really interesting for me to think about kind of why it is that I was interested in the question of whether Taiwan is kind of called to speak on behalf of China. And the reason I brought that up was because it was a question that was bouncing around, but also it was one that they themselves were actively engaged in. The idea that they could export this corpus to mainland China, it sort of ends up becoming a lot of the basis for these sort of debates about codification of the Qing Code in the decades that followed. So it's not because I myself am kind of trying to figure out that question, but because they themselves are asking that question. And then I'm trying to figure out how that then is embedded into the work that they produce, and how that influences people in subsequent decades who they themselves are also interested in a different version of that question. And yeah, I guess I'll just end there. I think the other presentations are really helpful for thinking of Taiwan SOFA as an archive and the kind of politics of the creation of that archive and how that can shape how we do or don't use the kind of information that's in there.
Okay. You have more questions, so you can have a little bit more time.
I'll try my best. Okay. So the first question is about the decolonization of the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan. I would say maybe the National Taiwan Museum and also the National Museum of Taiwan Histories are the two venues that are trying their best to talk about like the Japanese colonial history period. And so in the case of the National Taiwan Museum, I would say they are trying to see the positive aspects of how the Japanese anthropologists were doing to Taiwan. I mean, like, of course, they have their motivation, like from their colonial need, like to better understand this colony. But still, I think it's really important to see how the museum's attempting to give more positive evaluation of that period. And also in the National Museum of Taiwan History, they are trying to use this VR recreated technology, again, the modern technology to compare how the Japanese colonial period and also the Qing dynasty, like in Taiwan, are different. So they are trying to make people, the audience, to think about why they make the choice to kind of welcome the Japanese colonial like management in Taiwan, things like that. So, but also at the same time, because I haven't started my fieldwork yet, I still want to see if they are going to be kind of critical or invisibly critical about that particular historical period. And the second question is about how the what should the National Palace Museum do for doing with those Chinese collections. Well, I think so. It's really hard to say. It's really hard to get rid of the Chineseness of those collections that are just there. So we have to just cope with it. I think what they are trying to make people coming to the museums that they want to engage with the modern technologies, and to let people feel like, oh, actually those artifacts, even though they might be Chinese, they are still pretty. We can still appreciate that, and it's still okay to be in Taiwan. So there's another attempt I didn't include in my presentation, but they launched this drama series called 故事公寓, I think 2 years ago. So 公寓的公 is not like apartment, it's 故宫的宫, so they incorporate a lot of Taiwanese stories into reinterpreting the Chinese collections. So that's a really intriguing case to see how the National Palace Museum is still trying to make them relevant to the Taiwanese audience. But again, a lot of people will criticize that it's really kind of like over-interpreted. They don't really see the connections, but you can see they are trying to make the connection to the local people. So maybe that's another way of storytelling, I would say. And yeah, I also agree with Professor's comment that I should use identities instead of identity in my presentation. Yeah, I hope it answers your question. Thank you.
So moving on to, since you have more questions.
Well, thank you for all the questions. I thought, I was trying to keep my cover, and thank you, Professor Huang, for blowing my my undercover. And yeah. Well, yeah, and he exposed a Chinese agent. Anyway, so, but I think you raised a very interesting question. What is the China connection here? And does my own personal identity or my own personal academic interest, I consider myself a historian of modern China. And what is the China connection in this story of the history of Taiwanese archives? I think in terms of intellectual and political linkages, there are plenty. A lot of the archival institutions that the KMT built on Taiwan were already created on the mainland. And they inherited the filing practices, the organizational logic. So in many ways, this is a transnational history of information management in East Asia more broadly, whereas you see influences of imperial Chinese archival practices, but also the KMT also introduced, for instance, American filing practices, and also in places like Manchuria and Taiwan, there were also influence from Japanese colonial record practices. So all of these, I think, are incredibly important to understanding the history of political archives in Taiwan. And I also suggested in my presentation that the system of personal dossier and surveillance was also replicated, inherited by the CCP on the mainland after the Chinese Civil War. So there were plenty of connections. And I think another potential influence is precisely the ongoing threat from the mainland, which prompted many politicians and archivists in Taiwan to adopt a more circumspect approach to declassifying certain political archives. So I think the security threat is also there. Now, in terms of the second question that I gather from a number of the members of the audience, is the comparative question. What is unique about Taiwan? I think in terms of uniqueness, there is no question that the opening of archives is contentious, it's socially divided, and you can say that about almost any other society. But if you do compare Taiwan with other newly democratic countries, especially countries in Eastern Europe or in East Germany, the opening of archives was delayed by several decades, and there was no official mechanism of using the archives for lustration purposes, to remove former officials from their powers. So I think in many ways, I think a lot of scholars who work on transitional justice in Taiwan have made the distinction between there was official recognition of wrongdoing, but no official accountability, and people have periodized this divide by attributing the recent opening of archives to the electoral success of the DPP. So in many ways, I do not wish to suggest that Taiwan is somewhat a unique case study, but I do think it is fruitful, I think, to compare Taiwan with other countries. And East Germany is often hailed as an example of openness. But the truth is, many archives in former European communist states, such as Hungary and Poland, they are backsliding. The state is increasingly putting restrictions on access to political archives. And I think it offers a cautionary tale to Taiwan's ongoing experiment with openness. And finally, I wish to say something about the comment by Professor Katz about advocacy. Again, I think you know where I am from. I consider myself an outsider to many of the ongoing debates. I think it is not my personal criticism. And by no means I wish to suggest that, justice delayed is justice denied. This is just a question. All I'm trying to suggest that the protection of personal privacy is necessary. But it entails its own costs, and it requires tremendous bureaucratic manpower, time, and resources. And I do think that this is going to be an ongoing challenge with the dissolution of the Transitional Justice Commission. And I think how to ensure the future investment in the archival infrastructure in Taiwan will be an ongoing debate and issue, and to which I, observe with great interest. Thank you.
We still have 4 minutes, so if there's any last questions one wants to ask, or we can have tea early. But okay, then I'll just say one thing to wrap up, and that is, one thing I've learned from doing field work is, for example, when we talked about I mentioned the Mazu issue, and there was this great debate whether, it was Taiwan Mazu or Zhongguo Mazu, and, different Mazu, when Meizhou Mazu came to Taiwan, which temples would welcome, where they put the placards. But then when you actually go with the pilgrims, they don't have the idea of Zhongguo Mazu or Taiwan, it's Minnan Mazu. In other words, you can find a way to reconcile that, oh yes, okay, so Mazu comes from China, but it's also part of Taiwan. So this is especially, I think, relevant for the museum case where, different museums are trying to promote agendas, but the way people actually respond to them or receive these agendas may not be the same as the agenda that's being promoted. So I think that's just sort of a word of caution. But again, these have been 4 wonderful papers, and they've 4 very pertinent topics, and I look forward to seeing more of the work in the future. So thanks to you, thanks to the audience, and we will call it a day. Thank you.